Yeah, it's rolling, Mr. Kim.
This is roll 7, slate 1. Can you tell me whether General Nguyen can be excused for his action of killing that VC?
I don't think anybody can be excused from killing. I don't think anybody can be excused for killing an unarmed man. However, it happens in wartime a lot. General Nguyen wasn't exceptional in that. He killed the man, the Viet Cong, in the full view of the public in the streets of Saigon. That was exceptional for a national police chief to do that. There was a reason, of course, from his point of view. Only an hour before, he had learnt that the Viet Cong had swept over the police compound in Saigon, and his best friend, who was a police colonel, and the colonel's wife and 6 children had all been killed. Of course, the colonel was killed in the course of his duty, but the 6 children, and General Nguyen was the godfather to some of those children, had been murdered. Their throats had been cut. When the Viet Cong was brought before Nguyen in the street, he asked where he'd been captured, and the troops said he'd been captured near the police compound, whereupon Nguyen, whatever went through his mind, one can only imagine, but he immediately took his pistol and shot him. It can't be excused, but there was some reason behind his action.
That did get him into a lot of hot water. What was his attitude towards the press after that?
Politically, of course, Nguyen never recovered from that. Even today, he still suffers from that image. A few days later, I remember, he came to Hue, the northern city which had just been recaptured from the... a few days later, I remember, he came to Hue. I think we better stop this. I'm sorry. Of course, go on.
Did Nguyen ever recover from that incident?
He never really recovered politically from that incident. Nguyen is still suffering today from having shot that Viet Cong in the streets of Saigon. His attitude to the press didn't really change too much. He understood the press pretty well. I remember not long after that incident, he landed in the northern city of Hue. There was a battle going on between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese then for the city. As he stepped off his helicopter, he saw me, and I knew him quite well. He lifted his arm, to which he had strapped a machine pistol, something like it. It's really an automatic rifle, a sawn-off automatic rifle strapped to his arm, pointed it straight at me and said, "Someday I kill you." Well, he didn't mean that. It rather startled a British television crew who were standing right behind me filming. They thought they were going to have another shooting on their hands.
What did he mean then?
He really only meant that, as he said, too many pictures, too much publicity. That's all he meant. Certainly didn't mean he was going to kill me.
Do you think that colour television really made much of a difference between, say, seeing it in colour in America and seeing it in black and white in Australia?
Yes, colour television really created a tremendous impact on the viewer. Not so much in the general run of things as for what we might call normal news stories, but when there was war and literally a lot of blood and guts, and when it was brilliant red right there, brought into the living rooms of the viewer, well then it made a tremendous difference. Australia didn't have that for at least 5 years after America had it.
And after the Vietnam War actually ended.
The Vietnam War was very much run down from the Australian point of view at that time, so it wasn't of great consequence.
Did the American networks go in for showing much blood and guts on the screen?
No, the American networks are very conservative, actually. Some of the most conservative in the world. pretty much like the Australian networks actually. British television is much more adventurous, and Japanese particularly. They run a lot of war and horror and violence on their news programs. But American television is quite conservative, so the impact was not as great as it could have been. I'm sure if they'd have shown what the BBC or what Japan television stations were showing, well then there would have been as much violence in the streets of America as there was in Saigon practically, because the anti-war movement gained tremendous impetus from the fact that the Vietnam War was the first television war where the visuals were being brought home to the people day after day, night after night.
So that even though we're told that colour television did have an impact, it wasn't really as great as what it could have been because they weren't showing what was really happening in the war.
No, the impact of television was limited because of the conservative approach of the American networks. I'm only saying conservative comparatively speaking. Perhaps they showed enough as it was, and maybe their self-censorship was justified. They didn't impose harsh censorship which destroyed the meaning. What it really meant was that there wasn't as much blood shown on American television as there was on, for instance, British or Japanese or European television.
Was that very much a conscious policy by the networks until the war ended?
It's a policy which continues through today. American television news programming is more conservative where violence is concerned than most other Western countries.
Why?
Americans seem to have strangely enough, a natural aversion to showing violence on television.
How can you say that when you see all the Hollywood movies and all that other created violence that we...
I'll reconstruct that then. I'll say they seem to have a natural aversion to showing news, that is facts. They will show a movie like Bonnie and Clyde or Straw Dogs and lots of violence in a feature movie, which after all is fiction. But in news programs, they will restrict it somewhat. That's understandable in many ways, particularly in the Vietnam War, because a lot of the people they were seeing wounded, killed, and being affected by the war were their own people, their own soldier boys. So you don't really want to see your own soldiers mangled on the screen. Australia is even more conservative than that.
But that was the reality of the war, and that's what television was supposedly doing. That's what news is about, to present the truth to the viewers. That's what you were doing. Why wasn't it being shown?
Well, I think, to be fair to the American networks, they were showing as much as they could to balance it. It wasn't that they were restricting showing the American dead. In fact, the Defense Department had a policy that you weren't to show American dead, or wounded for that matter, simply because of their families not being advised and families seeing their dead boys on the screen or wounded before they were advised themselves. I think that's a reasonable policy.
If they had have been able to see their boys dead on the screen or mangled as was happening in the war, wouldn't this have brought the war home to the people, the reality, and made it end a lot quicker?
When I say see their boys on the screen, I mean literally their sons, or daughters for that matter, their sons. I don't mean just the American boys. I mean a father and a mother seeing his or her child dead or wounded on screen. And in that respect, I think the Americans were right. In general, when they restricted the coverage, they were possibly wrong because we restricted it too much. I think it's just too much. Take three. For example, when I was filming, I always thought, poor bastards, what if their mother or father see this on the screen before they're advised? So in for that reason, I think the American Defense Department were right. And the American networks who followed that policy were right. What I objected to was...
Do you think if they had have been informed and then they had have shown it, say, a week later after they had notified the parents, that would have been legitimate and would have ended the war sooner?
I don't think anything would have ended the war sooner, because the American presidents had so much power. It did move. It was a motivating force behind the anti-war movement. Yeah.